had failed their Black brothers and sisters in a variety of ways. Now, you may be wondering how, in a 7-year span, did this 260-year-old congregation transition from celebrating the 50th anniversary of its historic merger to that of recognizing its failures, its sins of, if you will, omission and commission, its needs to confess those transgressions and to seek the forgiveness of and reconciliation with their Black brothers and sisters? To answer the question, in part, we need to return to February 2020, just before the lockdown brought about by COVID-19. I was teaching a Sunday school class, which required that I do some research, not only regarding the history of First Presbyterian, but also how its history, along with that of York's own history, intersected with various national historic events. As a historian neophyte, I would soon learn how easily, and Jim, you know this as a historian, how easily pulling on one string of historic events and those persons connected to them can lead still to others, which then in turn lead to even more. With outdoor activities and travel severely limited by the pandemic, I had plenty of time to do more research than I otherwise might have been inclined to do. Initially, with the encouragement of some staff at First Presbyterian, I planned to write a script for a possible documentary, which, by the way, is now on the back burner. The central focus of my research and writing eventually began to emerge as 3 intersecting themes. 1, national historic events relating to York. 2, the history of First Presbyterian itself. And then 3, racial justice as related to slavery, abolition, Jim Crow, and the civil rights movement. Now, at this point, I need to acknowledge and thank several people whose own research and assistance have been invaluable to me. People like you, Jim McClure. Thank you so much, Jim, and for your support. Scott Mingus, Samantha Dorm, and Tina Charles, who are right now at this moment continuing to preserve the Black Cemetery, Lebanon Cemetery. And then Jeff Kirkland, considered to be one of the Black historians foremost here in the city. I am really grateful for their support and their contributions. While First Presbyterian was established around 1762, it is believed that the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians had settled into the area not many years after York was established in 1741. Around 1750, James Smith, signer of the Declaration of Independence and one of the founders of First Presbyterian, arrived in York, followed by other historic church founders such as Archibald MacLean, George Irwin, William Scott, and David Grier. On the other hand, it needs to be noted that along with their admirable contributions in the fight for our nation's independence from England, 3 of the men are also known to have been enslavers. That's another story for another time. If you want me to come back, Christian will talk about that. As my research moved me into the 1800s, another race-related theme began to surface in relation to First Presbyterian's history, that of abolition. While not overtly vocal in regard to his opposition to slavery, Reverend Robert Cathcart, the congregation's first and longest serving pastor, sided with the New School adherents, whose strong abolitionist leanings were readily apparent in the Old School, New School Presbyterian controversy of the early 1800s. But shortly after Cathcart's retirement, deep differences within the congregation eventually caused a split in First Presbyterian itself, eventually led to the famous Pennsylvania Supreme Court case regarding which adherents owned First Presbyterian's property. The New Schoolers won, who, as defendants in the case, had been represented by David Grier's own son-in-law, Charles A. Barnett, a well-known York attorney and former U.S. congressman, who apparently was also serving, albeit covertly, as an underground station master. In the years leading up to the Civil War, 3 pastors with strong abolitionist views were called to serve at First Presbyterian, then followed by Reverend Dr. Henry E. Niles, who was installed as pastor in 1865 on Easter Day, but in a black draped sanctuary, as the country had been catapulted into deep sorrow due to the fact that its iconic president, Abraham Lincoln, had been assassinated only 2 days before. Niles would become well known for many accomplishments during his 36-year tenure, but one which is often overlooked is that he served for 25 years until his death in 1900 on the board of trustees of the first degree granting HBCU institution, Lincoln University. This fact is important as it was not only reflective of a long-serving pastor's convictions in regard to racial justice, but also no doubt inspired him to play an important role in establishing Faith Presbyterian as the first and only Black Presbyterian congregation in York. The education provided to African-American males at Lincoln University was strongly rooted in the teachings of the Presbyterian Church, with a rigorous curriculum being split into 3 areas: preparatory, academic, and theological. Due to these hallmarks, among others, the school was often referred to as the Black Princeton University. The academic department, a 4-year higher education program, taught biblical, classical studies, science, and philosophy. The theological department was a 3-year program that awarded students the degree of the Bachelor of Sacred Theology. The college attracted highly talented Black male students from numerous states, especially during the long decades of legal segregation in the South. Among the future graduates would be 10 of the 12 installed pastors of Faith Presbyterian Church, including the congregation's first pastor, Reverend Edward W. Colberth. In 1895, Henry E. Niles presented to the Westminster Presbytery a petition from 70 signers requesting that it establish a new Presbyterian congregation in York. The Presbytery concurred, and a Presbyterian church was established. Its building, purchased a year before in 1894 at the encouragement of Presbyterian elder Samuel Small, son of the late Philip A. Small, was located only 1 long block from First Presbyterian at 50 North Duke Street. When the mortgage for the building was burned 8 years later on June 19, 1902, Small was partially credited with paying off the balance, thereby relieving the heavy financial burden of the fledgling congregation. The congregation would become known not only for its service to the Black community, especially through its community house, but also for its pastors, who were often strong civil rights activists during the early to mid-1900s. After a series of short pastorates, in December of 1950, the Reverend Dr. W. Edward Williams was called as the 7th pastor of Faith Presbyterian Church. 1 year later, he delivered an address to the Ministers Association of York, which would later be printed in its entirety in the York Gazette. He began by asking his white colleagues seated there before him this probing question: what is the problem of the colored people? In a bold and straightforward way, unheard of for such a time and place, Williams asserted that while the oppressive Jim Crow tactics of the South were far worse, those of the North, especially in York County, were anything but non-existent and undeniably no less discriminatory. He would then go on to list the ways in which the Jim Crow laws of the South were alive and well in York County, eventually castigating the media, and the white church for its complicity in the Black man's struggles. Unfortunately, while pastors like Williams and later on Thomas E. Montooth were speaking out boldly about the racial inequities so prevalent in New York, for over 50 years, the pastors of First Presbyterian appear to have neglected to follow in those footsteps of their white predecessors in the previous century, and in regard to speaking out and advocating for their Black sisters and brothers. It would not be until the mid-1950s that a bold young pastor, Reverend Dr. Ernest T. Campbell, would arrive in the same year as the famous Brown versus Education landmark decision and continue the legacies of the 1800s, and may well have helped prepare the way of the merger of 1965. In March 1916, the trustees of Faith Presbyterian Church decided to purchase the 3-story brick building located next to their sanctuary at 52 North Duke Street to be used as a manse for their present and successive pastors. It appears that with the purchase in mind, Reverend W. Edward Williams talked the matter over with Mr. Samuel Small Sr. and secured from him a check for $500 on the purchase price of $5,000, with an option that then being secured from Judge Warner, who was representing the Warner estate. Now, it should be noted that for several years before arriving in New York, W.E. Williams had been doing ministry work in connection to the YMCA in Baltimore. Therefore, it should be no surprise that when Williams had discovered that Black youth and adults had no access to the YM or the YWCA in York, he recommended to the church trustees that the 2nd and 3rd floors be renovated so as to serve as the church manse, but that the 1st floor be dedicated to serving the underserved Black community. And so, Community House of Faith Presbyterian Church was created, with Williams being granted permission by the church trustees to form an ad hoc committee of both prominent Black and white members of the church community with whom Williams could share his concept and seek their guidance. Subsequently, a board was put in place with Dr. George W. Bowles serving as president, Reverend Dr. Paris Daker, vice president, Reverend Dr. W.E. Williams, financial agent and president ex officio, Professor G.I. Reed, secretary, and as treasurer, Dr. James A. Dale, president of the York County National Bank. Only 3 years later, at the time of the burning of the mortgage, Faith Presbyterian member Glenn Alvin Goodrich, grandson of the late William C. Goodrich, had assumed the position of board president. In a pamphlet published for the purpose of soliciting financial donations to paying off the remaining $1,400 balance, thereby retiring the debt, the following facts were noted. What do we have? We have a large furnished reading room supplied with all the leading magazines and newspapers, with a circulating library free to the public, a reception room for free use by any society or organization needing a temporary meeting place, a game and pool room, a well-equipped dispensary, a small gymnasium, shower baths, and a large backyard for outdoor games. But then they went on. But what have we done since we first opened? We've enrolled 90 young men, 61 young women, and 36 boys. We've conducted a free employment agency locating about 60 persons in domestic service. We have a Sunday afternoon lyceum holding educational and patriotic meetings in the colored churches, bringing here as speakers many of the best colored men of the country and presenting some of the best white and colored musicians of the city. And we've also brought to the city the famous Williams and the Fisk University Jubilee Singers. We've conducted men's, women's, girls, and boys clubs and have had classes in first aid and domestic science. There is a troop of Boy Scouts doing splendid work. We've conducted a baby clinic for 2 summers under the direction of the Visiting Nurses Association, with Dr. G.W. Bowles and Dr. W.W. Gittins assisting. And we have cooperated with the Associated Charities, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children and Aged Persons, and the courts, taking 3 boys from jail and securing places for them. In conjunction with the Associated Charities, we are now caring for a mother and 6 children. We have done Red Cross sewing, knitting, pillow making during the past year, assisting the York chapter. For years to come, Community House would prove to be an essential building in the community and eventually serving as a forerunner of Crispus Attucks York. Itself founded in 1931 by original board president, Dr. George W. Bowles, along with Faith Presbyterian pastor, Reverend Thomas E. Montooth, and a few others. After W.E. Williams was called to serve a congregation in Detroit, Michigan in 1920, Faith Presbyterian was served by Lincoln University graduate George R. Brayman, whose years in ministry at Faith, unfortunately, have not been documented. As Jim Crow laws continued to be unabashedly practiced in York County, as W.E. Williams had noted only 12 years before, Faith Presbyterian Church called its 9th pastor in 1928. Born in Georgetown, British Guiana, the Reverend Thomas E. Montooth attended high school in New York City, graduated from Lincoln University in 1912, and became a naturalized citizen in 1925. Ordained as a Presbyterian minister, he served 2 congregations in Virginia before beginning his 10-year ministry at Faith only a year before the Great Depression hit. And eventually famous for his ardent civil rights activism, when he first arrived in York, he made it clear by stating, "If you're not willing to stand up for civil rights, you should step aside, get out of the way for those who are willing and ready to move." Short and slim in stature, characterized by some as having a compelling voice laced with a distinct Caribbean accent, Thomas E. Montooth is recognized as one of York's earliest giants in regard to those who have faithfully fought for the civil rights of all, and in particular, those of the city's Black community. Numerous times he would advocate for Black York residents who were unlawfully arrested or charged. Eventually, he would become the president of the local NAACP chapter established in York in 1944. In 1947, he was famously known for filing discrimination charges against the owner of an employee of a local restaurant for not serving him simply because he was Black. The case would eventually go to a grand jury, and but in spite of the fact, excuse me, I totally lost the place. The case would eventually go to a grand jury, but in spite of the fact that 2 York City police officers were called to witness on Montooth's behalf, and that he was represented by the district attorney himself, the jury did not find the 2 defendants guilty of violating the state equal rights law. Instead, the jury threw the case out and placed court costs upon Montooth himself. Disappointed, but not deterred, Thomas Montooth later released a public statement in which he asserted his determination to defend his civil rights, stating, "Should I encounter any infringement of my civil rights or privileges, I shall again seek legal justice in the manner provided by law." As time would show, Thomas E. Montooth did, in fact, continue standing up for his own as well as the civil rights of all York citizens up until his death in October 1977 at the age of 91. His funeral service was officiated by First Presbyterian Associate Pastor Leary Chase in the John Calvin Chapel just across the street. And he was appropriately laid to rest alongside his wife in what is now the well-known historic Black Lebanon Cemetery, established in 1872 when Black residents were not permitted to be buried alongside whites. In that same cemetery, numerous charter and subsequent members of Faith Presbyterian had been laid to rest. Among them were Alvin Goodrich Jr., who, as noted earlier, was the grandson of William C. Goodrich, born enslaved and later a successful York Black businessman whose house had served as a part of the Underground Railroad. Alvin Jr. was the son and namesake of an acclaimed pioneering Black photographer whose work has now been acquired by the Smithsonian. Next to Alvin lies his wife and his mother, Rhoda, who was from the Gray family and whose family residence, also a refuge for freedom seekers, was located just a block away from the Goodrich house, located on East Philadelphia Street, and now serves as the William C. Goodrich Freedom Center. It should also be noted that the center is located just around the corner from the former site of Faith Presbyterian Church. After Thomas E. Montooth's retirement in 1938, Faith Presbyterian was served by a series of 5 supply pastors. But it would not be until 1956 when a young seminary student who was a senior at Lincoln University arrived to serve Faith Presbyterian. Bright and engaging in personality, as well as having a keen intellect, Jason Jerome Cooper was called to, ordained, and installed at the church the following year. Thomas Montooth was present on that joyous day in 1957, noting that it had been 18 years since Faith had had an installed pastor. In that same year, Jerry, as he was affectionately known, would marry a beautiful young woman who was a member of Faith Presbyterian, Capitola Darrell Hall. The following year, on June 29, 1958, Jerry would lead the congregation in a special service to dedicate the new stained glass windows that had been installed in the front and sides of the sanctuary, as well as in the community house, along with a new outdoor bulletin board, some new lighting, and a number of other items. By the end of 1960, the congregation had retired 2 large debts. A letter to Jerome from Senate Executive Douglas Vance commended the congregation, stating, "It is a notable achievement, and I am sure your people can feel justifiable pride in this milestone." However, the sanctuary was badly in need of renovations, and dwindling attendance numbers and finances raised growing concerns. Nonetheless, with no doubt carrying a heavy burden in regard to the struggles of the congregation he had come to know and to love, Cooper not only faithfully continued to minister to his flock, but in the greater York community as well. During his 7-year pastorate, Jerome served as vice president and then for 3 years as president of the board of Crispus Attucks. Strangely, perhaps, during a time when the 30-year-old organization was in the midst of its own dark period, even considering merger with the York YMCA. In 1961, 5 years after Reverend Dr. W.E. Williams' famous address to the York Ministerial Association, Jerome became the first Black clergyman to be elected as its president. In addition, he served on the executive committee of the local NAACP, the board of United Way of York, the York Council of Community Services, the York City Police Advisory Board, and the York City Charter Committee. Unfortunately, In spite of his strong preaching skills, his contagious personality, and an enthusiasm for ministry, Jerome Cooper eventually discovered the profound, debilitating impact that almost 2 decades of inconsistent pastoral leadership had had on this once vibrant and community-engaged congregation. Conversations, albeit not public, of the possible need to merge with another Presbyterian congregation had begun within 3 years of his installation as pastor. And so in 1963, at the January meeting of the Presbytery of Donegal, the motion to dissolve Jerome's pastoral relationship with Faith Presbyterian was approved so that he might accept the call to the 770-member Berean Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. The historic Black congregation was founded in 1880, with one of its founders being the famous Underground Railroad conductor, author, and educator, William Still. Interestingly, at the same meeting of that presbytery, the request to dissolve the pastoral relationship of Oxford Presbyterian Church, Chester County, with Reverend Dr. Richard Oman was also approved, so that he might accept the call to First Presbyterian Church in York. Only a few hours after delivering his final sermon on Sunday, February 24, 1963, Jerome was honored by over 100 members of both the Black and white community of York. In presenting a plaque sponsored by numerous organizations and congregations, William Barber said Jerome was being honored in this way, and by so many, because his service had, quote, extended far beyond the limits of his church. No doubt the same would be said of Jason Jerome Cooper throughout the rest of his 32-year ministry at Berean and another 11 years at New Spirit Community Presbyterian Church. When Jerome unexpectedly died of a heart attack on December 29, 2007, at the age of 77, his obituary, published in the Philadelphia Tribune, noted that he had, quote, received many citations, trophies, awards, and honors presented at the local, state, and national levels. For example, as when the city of Philadelphia joined Berean in a tribute for his many contributions to his church and to the city. In addition, the U.S. House of Representatives also provided a tribute to him, published in the Congressional Record on behalf of the entire Congress. And earlier in the same year, the Pennsylvania House of Representatives cited Jerome as a humanitarian of the highest magnitude as a result of his leadership throughout his career. Equally notable, perhaps, during his years of ministry, Jerome also had met and become a friend with Bishop Desmond Tutu, was a guest at 10 Downing Street in London, England, and had been granted an audience with Pope John Paul II in Rome, Italy. In the same year of 1963, when Jerome Cooper assumed his call to Berean Presbyterian Church, 26-year-old Douglas G. Parks graduated from Union Seminary in New York City. He was also an experienced civil rights activist who, in 2.5-hour interview with me in August of 2020, he told me that during the summer of 1962, he had marched as a seminary student to desegregate Charleston, South Carolina, and subsequently had been befriended by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Doug recounted how, at their request, he had sat down with denominational officials of the United Presbyterian Church in its headquarters, 475 Riverside Drive in New York City. They told the white seminary graduate of a struggling Black congregation in York, Pennsylvania, for which the denomination could no longer afford to continue providing financial support. Would he consider going there as a supply pastor in order to do a sociological study of the community, consult with other Presbyterian pastors and congregations, and ascertain as to whether or not a merger with one of them would be feasible. After an encouraging phone call first with Martin Luther King himself, Parks accepted the challenge and was readily approved by Faith Presbyterian's church elders to serve as their supply pastor, and for the express purpose of exploring the possibility of a merger with another Presbyterian congregation. Unknown to Parks, his predecessor, Jerome Cooper, after engaging in conversation with Calvary Presbyterian's pastors on South Duke Street and the Synod executive, he had already broached the subject of Faith merging with Calvary, another struggling church in York, through his 1960 pastor's report to the congregation. Incidentally, Calvary had been founded by Samuel Small and his aunt and uncle, Samuel and Isabel Small, in 1883 as a mission outreach of First Presbyterian. Yet, after consulting with 7 other churches and their pastors, including Calvary, Parks came to the conclusion that First Presbyterian was the only one truly open to discussing a possible merger with the Black congregation. However, before those conversations would begin, Doug Parks was once again contacted by Dr. King and asked if he would travel to Selma, Alabama, to assist an equally young John Lewis in their voter registration efforts. With their blessing, the Session of Faith readily approved his trip. And it was there, in Selma, Alabama, March 7, 1965, that Parks would find himself on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, during what has become known as Bloody Sunday. Surviving the horrific event, and at King's request, Doug called all his contacts with various denominational headquarters, the National Council of Churches, as well as the 3 major TV networks, pleading for additional protesters to join them for the next march. Eventually, the youthful pastor accompanied King and Lewis to Montgomery, and then returned to York, even more committed to the potential merger that would eventually take place. Now in his early 80s, Doug Parks is the only living pastor of Faith Presbyterian Church and presently resides with his wife in California. During the ensuing months in 1965, 2 teams of members representing each congregation met to discuss possible terms of merger, timelines, etc. However, even before Marks had returned from Selma, unfounded rumors had already begun to swirl around the white congregation, claiming that a small group with a hidden agenda was behind the idea of a merger. Then, on Sunday, March 22, Richard Oman took to the pulpit, set aside his Lenten sermon, and delivered his well-known message, The Anatomy of a Rumor. With most members at First Presbyterian open to the possibility of uniting with their Black sister congregation, continual resistance came from some very influential members, putting Oman's pastoral skills to the test. Tempers flared in one meeting of the congregation, with applause erupting from each faction when their position on the potential merger was voiced. Angry letters with racist overtones were sent to the pastor and to the session. And some members expressed fears that healing might no longer be possible. A near collapse of the session's support of the merger proposal and terms was avoided when, once again, but now in a closed-door meeting, the firmly committed pastor of First Presbyterian challenged the elders in regard to their responsibility as Christian leaders. The session subsequently approved the Joint Merger Committee's recommendation that a special congregation meeting be held by each congregation. And so, on October 27, 1965, each congregation met separately to discuss and act upon the motion to merge. With 26 members in attendance at Faith Presbyterian, 24 voted in favor, 2 abstained. With over 300 in attendance at First Presbyterian, 229 approved the motion, 108 voted against. 2 months later, on Sunday, December 21, 1965, Faith Presbyterian held its last worship in its sanctuary at 50 North Duke Street. 3 days after, with a Christmas Eve crowd overflowing in the 1800s style sanctuary, the 2 York congregations officially became one. A total of 91 members of Faith agreed to have their membership transferred to the rolls of First Presbyterian. Now, by all accounts, the merger went smoothly. Only a few members from each congregation chose to leave. Some from Faith returned to Black congregations more aligned with their childhood experience or where other relatives already attended. And according to church records, very few members of First Presbyterian actually chose to transfer to other congregations, contrary to what had been predicted by opponents of the merger. From the outside, the story appears to have a happy Hallmark-type ending. A growing romance, nearly ruined, is suddenly saved at the last minute, and all live happily ever after. Or so the script implies. However, my own recent research into Faith Presbyterian's history, coupled with open and candid conversations about the merger and the decades following, have provided some crucial revelations. They are critical for a predominantly white congregation that is trying to become authentically multicultural, even in the midst of a polarized social climate where race and civil rights continue to dominate the public discourse, and growing movements such as white Christian nationalism are gaining more influence. Over the past few months, during Sunday worship, the First Presbyterian congregation has viewed a series of 5-minute videos which briefly cover important aspects of Faith Presbyterian's history. Somewhat surprisingly, even former members of Faith and their descendants have discovered facts about their own congregation and its pastors of which they had been unaware. In addition, the Racial Justice Task Force, formed after the murder of George Floyd, has provided opportunities for Black members to share candidly their own experiences of racism in daily life, of which their white counterparts had been unaware. Now, all of this has proven to be somewhat of a two-edged sword for First Presbyterian Church. On one hand, church members have learned that for years, the Black congregation was anything but a small, struggling church. But rather, during its 70-year history, it produced several of the most influential movers and shakers, not only in the Black community in York, but far beyond. In addition, the fact remains that Faith Presbyterian's community house was a forerunner of the highly acclaimed York Crispus Attucks Community Center. And I truly believe that the original concepts and community services provided by Community House shaped the original concept of Crispus Attucks. As a result, appropriately, First Presbyterian has been recognizing and celebrating Faith Presbyterian's rich legacy. On the other hand, revisiting Faith's past as well as the subsequent merger has provided opportunities for more forthright discourse. Conversations about First Presbyterian's unawareness of the grief experienced by members of Faith as their congregation was essentially disbanded, their church name retired, their sanctuary sold demolished, and paved over, and the proceeds from the sale apparently absorbed into First Presbyterian's church assets. In addition, the congregation has had to acknowledge that after the fervor of the merger subsided, the still predominantly white congregation missed opportunities for more intentionally including Black members in decision-making, of increasing an awareness among themselves of using racially insensitive language and stereotypes, and up and until recently, of failing to call Black pastors or other full-time professionals to serve on staff. In 2012, during the 250th anniversary celebration of the congregation's founding, former senior pastor, Reverend Dr. John Galloway, admitted that his only regret was that he did not encourage the congregation to call a Black associate pastor during his tenure in the 1970s. Looking back, some are now discovering the ill effects of these missteps, resulting in several former members of Faith transferring to other Black congregations only a few years after the merger. Now, 50 years later, the congregation presently employs a Black full-time program staff person, Marcia Mayfield, as Director of Caring Ministry and Community Outreach. And just this past July, another person of color, Daniel Brownell, assumed the important full-time position of Director of Worship and Music. And so on June 19, 2022, exactly 120 years after Faith Presbyterian's burning of their sanctuary mortgage, members of First Presbyterian Church gathered to worship, as well as to celebrate and to lament. Together, Black and white, they celebrated the life and contributions of a Black congregation. Together, Black and white, they lamented those ways in which their Christian sisters and brothers had fallen short in regard to standing with them in their quest for racial justice. And finally, Black and white, they gathered around the familiar table of grace-filled reconciliation, resolving to do better, and not only following the example of Christ himself, but also that of those champions of racial justice who had gone before them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Q&A.
Yep. Anybody has any questions for?
Yes, Jim.
No,
I'm afraid anytime he raises his hand.
oh, no, I don't know. Do you know whether Dr. Fools was a member of this congregation?
No, he was not.
Did
He was a member of, I just found out, I think he was small AME. I think I had seen somewhere that it was small AME that he was a member of.
I think it's just noteworthy. I believe this is correct that the Faith that church became available to the Faith congregation because Heidelberg UCC were German reformed at the time and moved to their new building.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is across from Central Market.
Some things I've read that apparently Samuel Small was already aware it was coming up for sale, and he went to the potential members, because they weren't yet formed, and told them they needed to buy it. So he helped them. So it's amazing that they already had the building before they'd officially petitioned the presbytery and became a congregation. I don't know who owned it at that point because there was no corporation. So somebody must have held the deed, but I haven't seen anything that tells you how they pulled that off. But that property was purchased before it was officially established as a congregation. Samuel Small, he was very influential in regard to Faith Presbyterian all along the way. It's amazing, but he also had helped to start Calvary. So they had a sense of mission and outreach. But the Small family, and I think you and I have talked about this, Jim, several Small families had very strong feelings in regard to slavery, abolition. Some were more obvious than others. but they were influential, I think, behind the scenes more than they were more covertly. And one thing I didn't mention is Samuel Small of Isabel and Samuel Small. He was also a trustee of Lincoln University, but only for 3 years. He and Niles overlapped by 1 year. Any other questions? I'm getting off easy.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, again, thank you very much for coming out and sharing that with us. And of course, thank you very much for everybody here in attendance today. So we will see you next time for November's second Saturday program, or excuse me, October. I'm already thinking ahead of time. So October is going to be next, I believe. That is going to be focused on the history of dance. More details to come out as well. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great rest of your weekend.
Yeah, I forgot to tell you, there are